Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be with you today for our session, How to Use Data to Improve Your Fundraising. We'll kill my camera so we can focus on the slides, which are far more interesting and important. First, let's just start with an introduction for myself. I am currently based in Sydney, New South Wales. I am originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I've been with Blackbaud for a little over 10 and a half years at this point. Been here in Sydney for a little over 7 years of that time, working on Blackbaud CRM as my major product. But far more, or at least equally important to my time at Blackbaud, is before joining, I was in not-for-profit organizations in the Northeast of the US for about 6.5 years, primarily as a database administrator, meaning that I was often the main or only resource who was really across query and a lot of our data analysis at some overall pretty small nonprofit organizations. So we are really gathered here, in my mind, to answer the following core question. This is really our mission statement for our session today. Do you at your organization have the information that you require so that you can make informed strategic decisions? And you may be thinking right now, yeah, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no, maybe in some areas or not. But I really want us to think about this mission statement, but I want us to think about this mission statement, not necessarily only around digital engagement, because I'm hoping that the concepts, the process that we're going to be discussing today is really going to be agnostic related to whichever part of your organizational efforts, what really makes your organization your organization. If this is digital engagement, if this is your outbound communications, whether it's DM, EDM, phone, SMS, whatever it may be. When it comes to acquiring your donors, or of course, the ever important regular giving program as well. Our goal is going to be to establish a data feedback loop so that we can better drive our internal strategic decisions. Now, I want to do a very, very brief recap of some of the webinars that Gregory Dellis, who is helpfully enough my boss here at Blackbaud, has done over the last couple of weeks and months right now. All of these are going to be available on the FNP YouTube site. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time. I believe the URL for that should be in the chat. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, highly recommend going back and taking a look. They're both quite good. But Greg went into a lot of depth about how do we really make our initial case for how we're going to be approaching our organizational goals when it comes to speaking to your organization's executive team. How do we go through the process of monitor, measure, and adjust to make sure that when we have our initial goal, we can continue to improve and really use our data in order to make those future strategic decisions? We also speak about where data really is key, and I want to really talk about this for a little bit. So as part of being a principal solutions architect and also in my past consulting, I both do a lot of work with not-for-profit organizations in the pre-sales process, where we are really gathering overall their requirements, but also during actual software implementation itself. And while every organization is very much different in a lot of key ways, whether it's exactly how they relate and engage with their constituents, how they specifically look to perform their fundraising, we definitely see some recurring themes across all sorts of different types of organizations, whether it's university, whether it's cause cure, whether it is in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, even in my past experience in the US and Canada. But often we find that organizations may not necessarily have the data in their minds that they really need to say by investing in this particular area, in this pillar of our overall efforts, we know we can get the best possible return on investment. We want to make sure that if you are doing your segmentation, if you were deciding on whether we want to go more for telemarketing or face-to-face or digital lead engagement, whatever it really might be, we want to make sure that you have those hard numbers so that we can actually make those best decisions going forward. The problem that a lot of these organizations have, and what we're really hoping to get into in our session today, is how do we go about finding those hard numbers? We know that we have very complicated operations. There are a lot of different pillars that we're really embracing. How do we really make sure we get those numbers so that we can intelligently make those decisions going forward? So let's talk about the process that is really, again, intended to be agnostic, depending on what you're looking to do, to really determine how organizationally do we get started in creating this feedback loop. We're going to start with considering our goals. Then we're going to establish our baseline to make sure we know what our fundamental numbers are going to be. Then we need to actually implement the mailing, the DLG, the recurring gift program changes, analyze our results, take our big lessons learned, and then the process is going to start all over again. It's not like we just do this cycle once. This is a cycle we want to make sure is repeating ad infinitum, continuously improving our overall operations. So let's talk about considering our goals. If we don't know what our end result, our intended end goal is going to be, then we're really not going to be able to move towards what we really, really are aiming for. So some of the major questions you may want to think about in this process. Overall, at the high level, what is our mission statement? Just like I did at the beginning of my presentation, what are we looking to accomplish? I always, when I'm working on a project, I always like to come up with a mission statement, an elevator pitch for what I'm looking to do. So that as I'm actually working through this process, if I find that I am drifting, or maybe I'm adding some other items that aren't super relevant, I can always refocus, bring myself back to that mission statement so that I really know that I am embracing the correct goals. What are the major categories of pillars of what we're looking to do? And very importantly, what hypotheses do we want to test? If we have a feeling that, I think that if we switch way more to EDM or away from DM, as an example, whatever that may be, I think this is going to lead us to the correct results. Having these hypotheses in mind right from the very beginning is really important. That way, at the end, you can really determine, was this successful or not? The second major area, what is it that we are looking to track? It's one thing to say we have these goals. It's another thing to know that, number one, we can actually accurately pull details in order to accomplish those goals and track whether we're accomplishing those goals. So can we actually get this information in? Can we then easily analyze it in an independent manner to make sure we can isolate if our hypothesis is correct? So what actual tools for data analysis are we going to use to maximize effectiveness? If this is in outbound emails, you want to make sure that things like your click rates, your open rates, your bounces and unsubscribes are going to be accurate. When it comes to overall changes you're making to appeals and solicitations, you need to make sure that the revenue we're getting is tied into the marketing efforts that we're sending out. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really hard for us to be able to pull those numbers in. In the next step, we'll talk about how we can also improve the data that we're looking to track as well. The third pillar, what is okay, good, and great? It is important to say we have certain milestones that we are looking to reach in whatever these goals and the data that we are pulling to make sure we have an idea of what numbers are going to represent success. Your first pass through this may be a little bit of a guess, but over time, you're going to be able to have a better idea of really what is going on with our numbers. which is really where our second step comes into play. We are looking to establish a baseline. What we find with a lot of our organizations is often they have overcomplicated what it is that you are doing. A great example for this, really the go-to example that always springs to mind first, is around segmentation. Now, most of the last really 7 years, all of it, I've been working mostly with enterprise level organizations. That doesn't mean that anything I'm talking about won't apply just as well to small and medium-sized organizations, of course. But a lot of those enterprise level organizations, when they do their outbound communications, they may have literally hundreds of different segments. I've seen up to over 1,500 in a single mailing. Now, that has a whole bunch of potential downsides. Number one, it's a whole lot more complicated and takes a whole lot longer to actually create. Number two, if you have 1,500 segments and you're sending out to 20,000 people, a whole bunch of those segments are not going to have a statistically valid number of people inside of it. So you can't really say, we know whether or not this is a good idea. Until you have a strong idea of exactly, of whether our data is going to be accurate, whether we can trust that information, I recommend dramatically paring down what you are looking to do. In many cases, you can take what are dozens or hundreds or thousands of segments, using this example, and bring that down much more to the top item, the this year's segment, rather than potentially having dozens or hundreds. This will mean that you are better able to establish that baseline to say, this is our control group. This is our starting point, so that in our future trips through this cycle, through this feedback loop, we are really able to then make some changes, tests, other theories that we may have in the future. Well, now we need to actually get into implementation. I can't really talk a whole lot about this right here because it really varies. It could be around your, face-to-face, your marketing efforts, your digital lead generation, your regular giving, whatever other programs you have. This is where you need to implement the plan that you have in mind, which then leads to the final of these 4 steps, where we're looking to analyze and then make our adjustments ahead of the next cycle. So going back to our questions, did we achieve our goals? So this is where we go into our reporting suite. Maybe it is a reporting or query tool inside of your system. Maybe it is bringing it out into Excel, into Power BI, Click, Tableau, plenty of other options as well. But by simplifying what we're looking to do, the analysis process should also be much simpler so that we can really track, hey, number one, are we able to actually say that the data we have is accurate? Were we able to implement this in a way so that we can actually verify our results? Then we move on to the next cycle where we really say, did this actually achieve all of our goals that we were looking to? This just happens to be from the marketing area in my product CRM, where we have expense details and total gift amount and average gift amount and ROI details, which are really helpful to say, is this marketing effort doing what we want it to? It's also great because I am using this in my internal environment where we can have some pretty fantastic 1,000+% ROI, which is always great to see. But that's not the end of the process. Because we have stripped out a lot of the overcomplicated data, because we are hopefully able to trust the data that we have, or if not, we have some idea of how we can improve the trustworthiness of our next cycle, we then move on to the and adjust process of this step 4. We don't want to take everything that we just did and then just say, okay, well, that was cool, and then start all new. We want to make sure we are building atop this foundation. Maybe we want to make some slight tweaks to our, say, segmentation, but we don't want to completely throw it out and then try an entirely different model. We want to make sure we take our lessons learned and then build atop that foundation, continually improving. As we turn the corner back into determining our goals, we want to look at what variables might we actually want to test going forward. What hypotheses do we then want to potentially test out? And then depending on exactly what you're looking to do, you may want to consider A/B testing. Maybe it's trying a different subject line. Maybe it is trying splitting out one particular segment, the exact content that those constituents are going to see, whatever the case may be. So often at so many organizations that I work with, I really do find that they so often take their entire segmentation model and then kind of start anew every single year. And that means they never really have the capability to say, how did we do in 22 versus 21 versus 20? Because you truly are comparing apples and oranges every single time. The other benefit, just from more of an implementation point of view, is by building atop that start. It means just plain less work when you need to create your next version of this, rather than starting completely over from scratch. So just to recap, we have create our goal, establish our baseline, and simplify what we are looking to accomplish. Then we implement our plan to the best of our abilities and make sure that we then analyze and adjust all of our results so that the cycle continues again. And then you can continually keep loading and reconsidering your strategic goals, having hard data to really back that up. Now, I wanted to make sure that we had ample time for questions. I'm more than happy to answer anything that you have at this point. I will open up the floor.
Okay, thank you, Sean. That was great. So everyone, I really encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions if you have them. This is the point to ask questions. I might just start off with a question, Sean, about segmentation.
Sure.
And I am someone who's been a fundraiser that's definitely been guilty of just creating well over 100 segments for appeals. Do you have... Can you put a number on what you recommend as being the maximum amount of segments in an appeal, or is it really about that? And what is the minimum number of donors that you would need in a segment to make it a statistically viable segment to track?
So the latter question is going to be a little tricky for me to really answer because it does tend to vary so much for organizations, but I think it will be answered by the answer to the former, which is I always like to start when I'm working with organizations or I'm really considering what their potential improvements to their segmentation is. I want to first pare it down to the absolute minimum. Now, this is going to be very different based on the functionality that you may have in your system itself. But what I often suggest is the major thing, just using my system as an example, the only time you need a segment is if you are varying the fundamental why am I blanking on the word? Content, of all things, that you are actually trying to send out to them. Because you could have 1,500 segments. If they're all getting the same thing, you literally could do that in a variety of other ways with a single one. So why don't we just do that? And a lot of times organizations say, there's no way I could go from 100, 200 to 1. But that really, I think, reframes the conversation by saying, what is it that we literally require inside the system, which is very, very different than what have we been doing. And I think if you, instead of thinking, oh, we're going from 150 to 100, if you instead think, well, we're going from 1 to 25, that's a very, very different conversation. And there are other tools that should be available to actually say, this is the who, the actual people and organizations in our segmentation. And you don't necessarily need a literal thing called segment for that. You could just say, who in this is a major donor prospect? Who lives in South Australia? Who lives in Queensland? You can then slice and dice that in a ton of other ways as well. So it's really about thinking, what are our core requirements? How can we strip this back to brass tacks and then build it back up in a way that's a whole lot easier?
Just going back there to what you said about slicing and dicing in different ways that isn't segmentation. Can you give me a couple of examples of what you mean?
Yeah, so, and again, I'm going to have to lean a little bit on CRM here, but we have we have a way that we can connect our revenue to our actual marketing items that we call our source codes, also a little bit of finder numbers. But once we actually have that connection, we can either say, were they in this exact segment, segment A, B, C, D, or we can just say, everyone who donated to this entire wave one, who lives in Queensland or South Australia, who graduated from particular faculty in our university, who is a regular giver, who is any other constituency that we have. Because we fundamentally have that connection, we can then really use whatever analysis tools at our disposal to then review, what are we doing? I find things like pivot reports to be extremely useful for things like that, because it can often just be one click to say, hey, I wonder what's happening here, to really familiarize yourself with that data.
Absolutely. Just talking there about pivot reports, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, what are some of your recommendations about how we take this data and translate it into things that are visually appealing and digestible for kind of boards and so on? Have you got any recommendations about?
I am a huge fan of Power BI. Power BI is not an easy system in a variety of ways. It seems, let me rephrase. A lot of the really initial things you can do in Power BI are incredibly easy. It's very easy to not immediately see the unbelievable amount of depth inside of Power BI. It has like 4 separate programming languages that it touches on, which is wild. So it does require a little bit of knowledge investment, and also really just solidifying your data flow from your system into Power BI. But once it's in Power BI, you can do unbelievable things inside of it. Power Pivot, on the other hand, is a whole lot easier. And I think it also really depends on how your system is going to provide access. You could do it with just static exports. CRM itself uses OData, or if you're self-hosted, you could use like SQL to make that connection. There are also all sorts of other connectors. The nice thing about that is it is procedural inside of Power Pivot. So back a million years ago, when I was the DBA, I would have to do static extracts, load it up in Excel, manually type or copy over my formulas every single time I did a thing, and it drove me nuts. With Power Pivot, if you have a live connection to your database, you say, I want you to do this with this column, and it's going to do that every time for you, which is a massive time saver to really keep you from being driven insane like I was.
Okay, good to know. It's not a product that I'm familiar with, but I'm hearing a lot of conversation about Power BI at the moment.
Power BI is incredible. You can do beautiful stuff.
Okay, thank you for mentioning that. Now I'm going to ask you one more question before we wrap up for today. You have mentioned during the presentation a couple of times just how important it is, and I completely agree, to have to be consistent, particularly year on year, with the way that you use data so that you can track progress year on year. And I'm imagining that that almost applies, but from appeal to appeal as well. I mean, I guess kind of some fundraising programs are so different from each other, it's not going to be possible to do it between every fundraising program. If you if there's an organization, and I'm sure there are people out there who are just kind of going, wow, our database is so big, we've got so many fundraising programs on the go, there's so many segments for tracking so many things. What would you suggest as kind of step one for kind of stepping back, taking a breather and going, okay, this is how we're going to get back on top of data, and this is how we're going to make it trackable and make it work for us? What would be step one?
I'll just use maybe regular giving, outbound solicitations as a good example. If you really just want to establish that baseline, to simplify what it is you're looking to do, a good way in my mind is to say, who are our loyal regular givers? Maybe they've been giving for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Who are maybe only 1 or 2 years? Who are our lapsed folk? You don't need to say, here is every permutation of recency, frequency, and monetary, as much as you can do cool stuff in RFM. Bring it down to what are those major categories, so that the next time, maybe it's 6 months later, maybe it is the next year-end appeal that you do, that you can then maybe do some testing and say, are they going to respond better to this message versus this message? And then roll that into the next possible approach. And that was the regular giving based example, just to think about what are the core categories. That would work just as well for other types of giving. At the university level, faculties are a good way. I've seen that really broken in. Or age-based, if you have a really active bequest program that you're also looking to drive engagement around. I really just like to think, what are the major categories? We don't need to worry about getting ultra specific right now. We want to make sure we know exactly what our data is and that it is accurate. And then we can go back to adding some of that additional detail, especially if you're fundamentally not changing the content that you're giving them. If you are, then that's a good case where you're really going to need to have a different segment for it. But otherwise, if everyone's getting the exact same stuff, really think, how can we simplify this as much as we can per our major categories?
Absolutely. Sage advice. Thank you, Sean. We are going to wrap up now. We've just got a comment that's come through from Ingrid, who has suggested that there is the suggestion that for data to be statistically robust, that you have a segment of about 5,000 or above. That's what MailChimp suggests. I know that quite a lot of small organizations just don't have that much data to start with, but I think your suggestion of just really questioning whether or not a segment is necessary, and also questioning whether or not it's possible to track donors in other ways, thinking outside of the segment box, I guess. I think that's really sage advice. So thank you, Sean. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Ingrid, there for your input. Really appreciate that. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. As we did mention at the start, this was a 3-part series of Blackbaud Tech Thursdays, and you can go to the F&P YouTube channel to watch all 3. I think what I've really learned from the 3 series is they've just been 3 sessions. They've just been really brilliant at kind of taking a step back and going back to basics when it comes to kind of your digital strategy and your data strategy, and from everything from kind of engaging stakeholders, internal stakeholders, through to today, kind of the more detailed look at data. So I really encourage everyone to go and watch those 3 YouTube videos. We will send out a video, email post-webinar with links to those and links to the slide decks for all 3 presentations. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's come to the whole series. We have 2 more left with Salesforce as well for Tech Thursday, so join those. And Sean, thank you so much for your presentation today. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Take care.